Entrepreneurship is not a concept that has a tightly agreed definition. In modern common usage, an entrepreneur is a person who undertakes an enterprise, especially a commercial one, often at personal financial risk. It is the product of a modern post-Enlightenment world in which continual change has become the norm, where progress, technical, social, and economic, has become expected and where notions of liberal individualism predominate. The ancient and medieval worlds seem not to have developed a concept of entrepreneurship that could plausibly be seen as similar to the modern notion. Philosophers gave only limited attention to economic matters, and insofar as agriculture, industry, and trade were discussed, much thinking would have been a sub-branch of politics or ethics. In the Aristotelian tradition, economic thought was highly normative. Trade was a suspect activity liable to undermine the good order of society and sterile in itself. Even if the reality was more complicated, early social thought concerned static societies built upon caste or social position, where justice was the outcome of each group faithfully performing its allotted function. In the hierarchy of social esteem, the noble warrior took pride of place. Agriculture was respected and compatible with the inculcation of certain virtues. Industry in support of military power was too useful to neglect, but commerce was the province of less respected, if not completely despised, social groups. It is not difficult to understand this Carly suspicion of commerce in the trader. The landed aristocrat had large, illiquid, and specific, a geographical region investments to protect. As with a player in a modern game theoretic model of oligopoly, such a person could plausibly commit to fight interlopers. For the widely traveled merchant with access to ships and with assets in liquid and non-specific form, the temptation simply to move elsewhere when the fighting started and to deal with the winners would have been compelling. The aristocrat's position depended upon a willingness to deter others and to fight for what was his. The merchant's position derived from an ability to go where he was treated tolerably and to flee from unrewarding environments. Where violent conflict was endemic or its likelihood significant, nobles and merchants were thus hardly natural allies. Another reason for the Carly disapproval of trade, and in particular the use of money, was its association with situations of distress. Where agricultural production dominates, and this is mainly accomplished on large estates using slaves or serfs, the economy has many of the features of an extended household. Indeed, the modern English word economics derives from the Greek oikonomid, or law of the household. Production and consumption in these conditions are largely undertaken locally within the relatively self-sufficient household, and trade with outsiders is limited to luxury goods for high-status members, or imports of food and other staple goods at high prices in the event of crop failure. The result would tend to be an association of the merchant with frippery on the one hand and ruthless exploitation on the other. In the medieval era, the authority of St. Augustine held that it was unjust to buy below or sell above the just price, while usury, interest on the use of money, was condemned in the religious teaching of the era. Each of these doctrines should be seen in the context of the conditions of the time, and scholars have argued about their precise interpretation and force. But even allowing for scholarly refinements, the doctrine of the just price would appear to be highly subversive of entrepreneurial activity. When the whole of society is viewed in terms of duty and obligation in the performance of divinely assigned and sanctioned roles, and when preparation for the next life, rather than the improvement of material conditions in this one, has the higher priority, entrepreneurship could hardly be expected to feature prominently in the prevailing economic thinking. Absence of a well-developed conception of the entrepreneur in the philosophy of the time in no way implies that economic conditions were completely static, trade suppressed, or technology totally unprogressive. Roman law, for example, developed highly individualistic concepts of private property and contract, which permitted the development of an extensive and sophisticated European trading network. Venetian dominance of Mediterranean trade in the early Middle Ages could not have developed without an environment sufficiently conducive to entrepreneurial activity. Even the medieval economy outside the city-states, which in its social stratification and apparent stability is popularly seen as stagnant, is now regarded by historians as having experienced considerable technological advance. Nevertheless, the distinct notion of an entrepreneurial role awaited an era in which success in commerce and the political power of the state were more closely associated. With the rise of the modern nation-states of France, Spain, and England, from the late 15th century onwards, rulers began to take on at least one characteristic of the merchant. No longer able to rely on feudal obligation from the nobility to protect their interests, the accumulation of treasure, and hence the ability to pay armies, became associated with the maintenance and projection of political power. The mercantilist doctrine that emerged from this era was criticized by later classical economists for confounding money with real national wealth, although it is doubtful whether mercantilist writers succumbed fully to such a fallacy. For present purposes, however, it is relevant to note that the building of the power and revenue of the state was the central concern. Such a project is unlikely to be conducive to the growth of decentralized and competitive markets, and thus might be seen as inimical to the social development of the entrepreneur. Bureaucratic intervention, the selling of monopolies, licensing, and taxation are not the most obvious routes to the entrepreneurial society. However, compared with the world that had preceded them, the 16th and 17th centuries were the more conducive to entrepreneurship. The state as an economic organization, an idea which underlay mercantilist thinking, and the accumulation of treasure that was seen as a means of building state power required the input of entrepreneurial and not merely bureaucratic talent, at least in the context of the competitive states of Europe. The whole enterprise may have been statist at heart, but it relied on people to develop overseas markets, to build great trading companies, to strengthen domestic industry, and to generate a large tax base. People of energy and talent could migrate between jurisdictions, and the willingness of other places to receive them placed limits on the exploitation that they would tolerate in any given location. English words now often used to describe entrepreneurs, such as buccaneer and privateer, derive from this period, as the state tolerated or even encouraged the piratical disruption of the trade routes of other nations. As the profits of trade increased, the old aristocracy in England began to accept trade as a respectable activity. Money talked. Defoe commented that trade is here so far from being inconsistent with a gentleman that, in short, trade in England makes gentlemen, while Voltaire observed that it is only because the English have taken to trade that England can have 200 men of war and subsidize allied kings. It was, however, the agricultural and industrial revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries that finally produced the modern, multifaceted image of the entrepreneur. As rulers gradually submitted to constitutional constraints on their power and property rights became more secure within the nation-states, entrepreneurial energy was reicased at a historically unprecedented rate. In England in particular, major advances in agricultural productivity and innovations in transport, mining, textiles, steel, shipbuilding, engineering, and banking became associated with particular names. The Duke of Bridgewater in the construction of canals, Richard Arkwright in the transformation of the cotton industry and the evolution of the factory system, Matthew Boulton, John Roebuck, and James Watt in the development of steam power, George Hudson in the promotion of railways. These and others introduced the revolutionary changes that still color our image of the entrepreneur. The men of business of the 19th century represented a new social phenomenon. Checkland, 1964-103, writes, "It is probably not far from the truth to say that the period from 1815 to 1808 in Britain represents the range of human experience in which individual economic initiative had its greatest opportunity to operate upon men and things, and in so doing to remake an ancient society. From this period derives the idea of the heroic entrepreneur, a transformer or founder of industries, an undertaker of massive feats of engineering, an opener of continents. Such activities required the raising of enormous quantities of capital, the development of new organizational methods, and the coordination of vast numbers of people. The failures could be as spectacular as the successes. Entrepreneurship of this order required as much strategic insight, tactical awareness, personal energy, power of leadership, organizational flair, ruthlessness, and determination as military conquest. And like the military commander, the entrepreneur began to be studied and respected. In the 20th century, the cult of the entrepreneur initially receded. The large-scale organizations established in the 19th century and the corporations developing in the newer electrical, chemical, communications, and motor industries began to look more managerial and professional than heroically entrepreneurial. The entrepreneurs having blazed their pioneering trail, it began to be scriously considered that professional scientists, technicians, and managers would be able to maintain momentum. By the 1940s, Schumpeter, 1942, was advancing this view, and others such as Jukies, 1948, were specifically asking the question, is the businessman obsolete? Later developments in the century were to redress the balance somewhat. In the UK, for example, the shipbuilding, coal, steel, and cotton industries all but disappeared, and this substantial and continuing restructuring undermined the notion that change of this degree could be brought about by managerialism alone. The growth of the service sector of the economy and the development of computer technology and communications may also have contributed to a rise in self-employment and small-scale entrepreneurship. From this brief historical review, it is apparent that popular conceptions of the entrepreneur have evolved over time. The somewhat varied notions that still prevail reflect this history. The small-scale trader and peddler, the self-employed craftsman, the buccaneering chancer, the innovator and improver, as well as the founder of entirely new technologies and industries are all seen as entrepreneurs. It is evident, however, that a coherent theoretical treatment of entrepreneurship is not automatically suggested by the history of economic and social change. The birth of classical political economy coincided with the upheavals of the agricultural and industrial revolutions of the 18th century and an interest in the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Yet, both in its classical and later neoclassical formulations, economics as a discipline has not found it easy to find a formal place for the entrepreneur.